At this point, I want to introduce Adam. Adam has 3 degrees in fisheries. He's Mass Wildlife's cold water fishery project leader. In 2018, he got a conservation award from Greater Boston chapter, and he presented on wild trout only about 2.5 weeks or so ago at a wild trout symposium in Montana. Well, that presentation was not just about wild trout, but it was wild trout in the Deerfield. So that's the presentation that we're going to have tonight. Thanks, Adam, for coming out. We're really excited to have you and really excited to hear the results of what you've been doing for the past 3 years.
Eric is right. I did give a version of this presentation to the Wild Trout Symposium in Montana a few weeks ago. It got pretty good reception. I especially got a lot of questions about the raft from guys that work in the East. It's not common out here. I know when I used to work out West, all the state agencies have raft electrofishing. It's not so common here. I think we're definitely the first. We may still be the only state along the East Coast that has a raft electrofishing. So, and that's all thanks, largely to Deerfield TU. So, it's been a real boon to our ability to survey larger rivers. So I'm going to talk about the Deerfield River brown trout, some of the work we've been doing over the last going on 4 years now. I'll touch on at the end some of the new stuff that we just started with Eric, looking at the wild rainbow trout. But the bulk of this will be about the brown trout. So you guys all know about the Deerfield River tailwater. It's long been considered a high quality trout fishery. There's numerous guides, a lot of recreational anglers that use the river. It's really, the major draw is the potential for catching big brown trout. But there's been a lot of debate over the years on whether those brown trout are wild fish or stocked fish or holdover stocked fish or some combination of the two. And until recently, we really haven't had the ability to answer that. Really until we had the meeting with Deerfield chapter, what was that, 2017, 2018, where we sat down and they asked me what I needed to, survey the river. And I said, we need a raft and electrofishing equipment and things like that. And they really, came through and got it for us. And so we've been able to survey and answer some of these questions. And so, really simple goals for this project, answer this wild stock debate, which I think we have clearly answered that. And I'll run you through that here in a little bit. And then gather data on key fishery metrics, particularly population abundance in this section of the river. And then, as we're out there, compiling baseline fish data, because we knew that at some point there was going to be a change, or hopefully going to be a change in the flow regime out of Fife Brook Dam. And so having this baseline data before that change occurred is going to allow us to go back and then compare what happens after that change, whenever that may be. But I think we've accomplished all these goals, and they're all going to have important management implications going forward with how we look at the river, how we manage the river, how we deal with the fishery on the Deerfield River tailwater. So, I probably don't have to run through this. You guys all know the Deerfield River. Just, as an aside here, everything highlighted in blue is a wild trout stream. So there's a lot of wild trout streams in the Deerfield Basin. The big one running through the middle is obviously the Deerfield. The red section is our study area. So from Fife Brook Dam down to Shun Pike is our study area for this project. So I've mentioned this a little bit, and I think this was a big piece of what I talked about at the Wild Trout Symposium, because the theme of the Wild Trout Symposium, it wasn't just strictly science. It was sort of, a mixed group of people, media and NGOs and other organizations. And so they really wanted the talks to be centered around, how do you engage the public? How do you communicate science to the public? And I put this talk in because I thought that it was a really good example of how, working together with Trout Unlimited and other groups really had this project come to fruition. Without that relationship, this may never have happened. And so, just interacting with anglers, guides, wild trout advocates like yourselves really is what kind of drove the project to start. we heard from all of you that you wanted us to, revisit management strategies. We didn't really have a cohesive management strategy for the Deerfield River. We have a couple of catch and release areas. We didn't know a lot of information about the trout population in the river. So, we kind of managed it just sort of at a baseline level that we didn't really know a lot about it. So, having that encouragement that you want to revisit management strategies, clear up some of the misconceptions. How many fish are in the river? Are they wild? Are they stocked? Are they some combination? And then again, the baseline data. I think that was another big piece that people were interested in for this dam relicensing, but also as other dams come up for relicensing on other parts of the Deerfield, especially having that sort of before after information is going to be important. And then again, I mentioned this already. The donation of the equipment was really important. So Deerfield TU and especially Jim Dowd, who actually donated the raft and the frame right out of his garage. So that was a really big thing. We use that raft everywhere, not just on the Deerfield. We use it on the Swift. We used it this year on the Squanicook and the Nissitissit. We use it on the Housatonic. We're going to use it on the Hoosick. So all of the large trout rivers that we never really surveyed in the past, or at least didn't survey effectively, we can do a whole bunch of work on now and learn a lot more about them. So, next slide. All right, so getting into the actual Deerfield River project, we started back in 2018, where we began doing an adipose clip to all of the brown trout that get stocked into the Deerfield River. We stopped stocking the tributaries to the upper part of the Deerfield, so we wouldn't have this, conflict of hatchery fish that were unmarked coming into the main stem. So we wanted to be able to, when we did our surveys beginning the next year in 2019, we wanted to know clearly if it was a hatchery fish, it had an adipose clip. If it was a wild fish, it had an intact adipose fin. So a really clear way of telling the difference. Next slide. And then we started in 2019, the following year, with our raft electrofishing surveys. And so that highlighted area in red, our study area is about 13 kilometers. We did surveys on about 11 of those kilometers. We skipped the Zor Gap and then a little bit of area up near the dam, but we surveyed most of that 13-kilometer section. It takes about 2 days. We do it once a month, May through September. It hasn't always been perfectly aligned once a month because we do have to rely on Brookfield Power to give us certain flows. The base flow is way too low to float the raft and survey, and whitewater flows are too high to be efficient. So we have to, coordinate with them to get the appropriate flow levels on a Monday and Tuesday, May through September. And so it doesn't always work. But for the most part, we've been pretty good in doing it once a month over the past, 4 or 5 years. So while we're out there, every brown trout we collect, we weigh it, we measure it, and we fit it with an individually numbered tag. It's an external tag. I don't know if anybody's caught one, but there's a phone number on it, an individual number on it. It's right near the dorsal fin. It's brown, so it sort of blends in. And if it's been in the river a long time, it's completely covered with algae, so sometimes you don't even notice it. When we catch fish that have been, released a number of years ago, we really got to scrape the algae off to actually see the number. And then we also check for adipose clips. And so, having these fish tagged and released and recaptured again, it allows us to do population estimates, and I'll get to that in a little bit. We also do set up transects, 400-meter transects along the banks to do young of the year backpack surveys. So rafts and boats, are great survey techniques, but they're inherently biased against smaller fish because you don't always survey the right types of habitat with rafts, and you also aren't as adept at netting, tiny fish from a moving raft. So we set up transects, and we do them each year, just specifically looking for young of the year fish to monitor abundance as we go through time. Next slide. So results, very simple results, very straightforward study, but I think really important. We were able to show, what a lot of people already suspected. Not everybody at the agency necessarily suspected this, but we saw over the course of the 4 years in the study, over 80% of the brown trout in the Deerfield River tailwater are wild fish. There is a component of that which are hatchery fish, but it's relatively small, and we don't see, repeat holdovers of hatchery fish. It's usually the fish that were stocked that year. We collect those in our surveys. We don't find, large holdover stocked fish. So the larger fish you're seeing are almost exclusively wild fish, and we find, all age classes, all size classes of wild fish. So predominantly a wild trout fishery, or wild brown trout fishery. And I'll sort of touch on, what that means kind of for our discussions on how we manage the fishery, but I'll do that in a few slides. So abundance was lower than expected, given water temperature and the quality and sort of availability of habitat. I wouldn't read too much into these numbers as far as strictly a number, an abundance on that, because the river is big. It's hard to survey completely. So these are likely an underestimate, but given that, they still are lower than, I sort of had envisioned in my mind. And there's a lot of reasons why that might be. We can sort of discuss that as we go along, but you see that over the 4 years of this study, the average was about, 68 adult brown trout. So these aren't taking into account the young of the year, which would probably double these numbers in some cases, but about 110 adult brown trout per mile, which is not a lot. But again, don't put too much emphasis on the number, because this is a likely some level of underestimation because of the difficulty of surveying such a large river. But it doesn't matter so much in the long run for our purposes, because we're using the same methods before and after. So we'll be able to compare the population that we're estimating now to the population that we're estimating post flow regime change. And so it'll be relatively comparable. So it'll be important in that regard. But again, comparing to other wild brown trout fisheries in Massachusetts, the Deerfield is quite a bit higher on average, abundance-wise, than other similar sized rivers. But compared to all brown trout fisheries, it's kind of quite a bit lower. You can do it next slide. Looking at it slightly differently, where we're not looking necessarily at specific population estimates, we're looking at catch per unit effort, CPUE. So that's basically a relative way to look at abundance of fish. And so this is just the number of brown trout that were collected per hour of electrofishing. And a lot of times this is how biologists compare different populations, because it is so hard to actually get a real population estimate, and we don't do it anywhere else in most places in the state. So it's hard to compare population to population when you only have sort of relative measures. But again, it's a similar relationship. The catch per unit effort of brown trout in the Deerfield River, higher than similar sized brown trout fisheries elsewhere in the state, but lower than brown trout in general. Change it slide. But young of the year was another interesting, hold on, let me get a drink of water. I guess before we get into the young of the year, does anybody have questions? No. Okay, well, we can, if you have questions, feel free to shout them out. So young of the year surveys, we didn't do it in 2019, we just started in 2020. So we have 3 years. And really the abundance sort of matched what we thought we would see compared to the adult population. So very low abundance of young of the year fish. We were getting 10 or 12 total in our young of the year surveys at our transects we set aside. Very low abundance, pointing to some of the stuff like Mike Cole and other guys found when you did your spawning surveys, that reds were dewatered, not a lot of successful reproduction and recruitment, sort of laid out here, not a lot of recruitment to young of the year. So kind of something we'd expect. But you see this huge jump in 2022. We found a 4-fold increase in young of the year, same transects, same methods, but a huge increase. And, I'll sort of touch on that a little bit more, in the next slide or two. But, we think that, and even in this 1 year of data, we think that it may have something to do with the previous year's flow conditions, which it was a very wet year. It only dropped below about 300 CFS at the Charlemont gauge about 2 or 3 times in February. So that might be sort of, a look into the future. Again, I don't want to put too much emphasis on this because it is only 1 year, and it may just be an anomaly, but it may be a look into the future where we see higher winter flows, much better young of the year survival. And then if that sort of cascades into, higher survival, recruitment of adult fish, we may see that 110 fish per mile, which is fairly low, jump up. Yeah. Well, this year's drought, the drought in places like the Deerfield is not that dramatic because it is, controlled by a lot of flow from upstream. Small streams, isolated streams, yeah, problematic with the drought, but it really isn't a huge issue for the Deerfield, the tailwater. So we'll see. I mean, there was a big drought in 2016 as well. We don't necessarily have data to point to any conclusions for young of the year survival, anything like that in the Deerfield. But it's a good question. You have something?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating graph there, how that plays out over that years, how that plays out with young of the year surveys, depending upon what the flows are, because that's going to be the basis of the next license, where we're really going to be able to make some hay, because Brookfield is limited as to how much they can impact the flow. It really comes from above. And this kind of, so now if we have 225, and if we can demonstrate if there are unique performances of this, where we're having greater saturation in excess of 225 on average for the winter months, that would be indicative and proof that, we actually, maybe finding 350 is the better number to get it. So that kind of information is really interesting.
Yeah, that's why it was.
See how that plays out over the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it is 1 year, but it's sort of encouraging that there's that relationship so far. So next slide. So again, it seems like survival, once they get past, get to the young of the year stage and past it, is relatively consistent. So you see, these are length frequency histograms, so the number of fish in each sort of length group for the 4 years of surveys. I've included the young of the year information on there so you can see how dramatic it was in 2022. So those are, to the left are smaller fish, to the right are larger fish. Everything in red is a hatchery fish. So you can, you see in 2019, there's that little red bar. That shouldn't be there. I screwed up on the coding. So that should be gray, that little red bar that's in like the 550 millimeter range. But you can see that it's generally flat. There's some ups and downs just indicating, sort of the differences in year classes, but you don't have this sort of trend where you see a lot of fish populations where there's a lot of younger fish and there's sort of a dip through the older fish. You kind of have pretty consistent survival over the years. So, once they get up to this point, there's not a lot that is sort of killing them, at least looking at the length frequency histograms. So it could be, there is the potential that if we have higher survival of young of the year, everything's going to sort of lift this up. So, sort of everything gets raised up a little bit because survival seems to be consistent. But that remains to be seen, if we see a consistent increase in young of the year survival, if everything else gets sort of lifted up with it. And, that would be a really, really great thing to see. So we'll see what happens. But again, the red, you can go back just a second. The red is hatchery fish. So you can sort of see where the hatchery fish fit into that. They kind of prop up some of that middle range, the fish that people generally, size class that people generally catch. So, again, we only recaptured a small number of fish, and that's partly why our population estimates, they don't hold a ton of water. So again, it's more of a relative comparison. But we were able to sort of pull this out and look at kind of growth rates. And again, because we only recaptured 29 fish, I wouldn't put, too much emphasis on these calculated growth rates, but it gives you sort of a ballpark of what we're looking at with growth rates of brown trout in the Deerfield. So, it varied from, no growth really to 14 millimeters a month. So, kind of all over the place. Some of the fish that we saw, especially the smaller fish, the ones that were less than about 12 inches, grew, on average, like 4 inches a year. So they really put on a lot of, and that's, on average. And the larger fish, were much more slower growing.
How many fish did you capture?
And we captured and tagged somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 or so. So yeah, not a lot of recaptures.
I understand his recapture rate's about 1% is what you expect.
It depends on where you. It depends on where you are and sort of what methods you're using, but yeah, it's okay. But 10% I think is more sort of preferable, and we're a little bit below that. All right, so just to wrap up the brown trout stuff before I touch on a little bit of the rainbow trout. Again, predominantly a wild brown trout fishery. So there's actually been, some movement on, and, don't quote me on this, please. But anyway, all right, so maybe I won't say, I'll talk to you guys separately. But whether or not, there actually has been conversations about, are we going to no longer stock this fishery? Are we no longer going to stock the fishery? There are conversations to that level, whether or not with brown trout. Not, we'll continue with the rainbow trout, but again, don't quote me on that because it's just sort of the very beginning conversations of turning this into what I think everybody wants at this point is a wild brown trout fishery exclusively. So at least that's sort of trending that direction. No decisions have been made yet, though. Again, relatively low abundance, and we sort of talked about don't read too much into the population estimates, but again, it's lower than we expected, and there is the potential that with better recruitment, better survival of young of the year fish, with this change in flow regime, we could find a jump up in abundance of all size classes, in the future. And we're going to continue to monitor, especially these age 0 fish. I think for this round of study, we're no longer going to be surveying the adult fish until after the flow regime changes, but we will continue to monitor age 0, so the young of the year fish, and track that through time, because I think at this point that seems to be really what is being affected, the most by current flow regimes. Next. Okay, so does anybody have any questions on the brown trout stuff before I have a couple slides on the rainbows? Yeah.
When you did your surveys, did you find any of our fish that had transmitters in them?
I did not. So yeah, no radio transmitters in any of the fish that I found.
Can you repeat the questions, please, Adam?
Okay, sorry, yeah. He asked if we found any radio transmitters in any of the fish we surveyed, and we didn't. Okay, so I'll try to paraphrase that. So Paul asked that if we end up, not changing regulations at some point in the future, and it continues to be stocked, that we should continue to clip the brown trout and make only clipped brown trout harvestable. Is that the gist of it? Okay. So, you know, I would prefer to just, you know, go the route of not stocking. It would save, you know, because the way that we're set up in the hatcheries, we go and we clip the brown trout with the scissors. You know, we're not really set up to like they are out west where they do mass marking of these fish. And so, you know, that would just add you know, extra level of work for the hatcheries and for everyone every single year. And then, you know, how do you enforce that? You know, oh, I thought it wasn't clipped, you know, if somebody, so, but I would prefer just the simpler, easier route. If we make a decision to no longer stock, just to go with that. Yeah.
And we just want to move on. But I have a question, Adam.
Yeah.
Is there any insight to be gained by looking at that 18% of stocked fish against the known amount of fish that have been stocked in that area? Can you interpolate kind of, you know, how close? It's another way to take a look at your measure of, you know, what's the population abundance.
Yeah, so I mean, we haven't recaptured enough of, you know, clipped hatchery fish to be able to develop any sort of estimate. But there's only, you know, it depends on the year, but 800 to 1,000 brown trout that go in to the Deerfield, you know, that upper part of the Deerfield each spring. So it's not a lot of fish. And, you know, so it's, yeah, I'm not sure. We aren't able to come up with a population estimate of actually what's there because we haven't recaptured enough clipped hatchery fish.
Yeah. All right.
But yeah,
thanks.
I understand what you're saying. Yeah, so I mean, I think we're having those conversations about, and I think that this, this enlightening, 80% wild fish was a surprise to some folks. And so I think that has made them much more, they were a little hesitant before because they weren't sure and they just stopped stocking and then everybody complains, and so now that they kind of know, they're like, well, this might be a potential. So, but also realize that if you crop off that top 20% and there's not a huge amount of fish out there anyway, there may be some people that are upset. So, it's one of those things. I don't know what that proportion of people are, but I'm just, throwing that out there.
I think it's an opportunity to just as far as a total management plan, because let's face it, the more this river gets attention, you're going to see more people here. There's going to be more pressure. There's going to be more, death as a result of this handling of fish, and it's going to happen. It's going to happen.
All right, so I'll just touch on a little bit of the rainbow trout stuff that we've gotten started this year. So I'm helping out Eric and the Deerfield chapter on some surveys for looking for wild rainbow trout in the tributaries to the Deerfield. So, obviously there's clear evidence. We have records of young of the year wild rainbow trout, historic records back to the 30s in some of these places. But, more recently in the past couple of decades, there's about 7 or 8 streams that have, records of young of the year or clearly wild rainbow trout. They're all listed here, and I'll have a map on the next slide. But this year we actually found 3 new populations that we hadn't had in our records. So the lower Bear River, we had never surveyed young of the year rainbow trout before. Pelham Brook near the mouth as well. And then Upper Branch, which is a tributary to Clesson Brook, are 3, and then Rice Brook, I believe, Mike, you found some too. So actually 4 new streams with new records of young of the year and wild rainbow trout. So, we occasionally see older age classes of what we're assuming are wild rainbow trout. Some are pretty clear because they're far smaller than the general stocking size fish. But, you know, we don't see them all that often. They're here and there. And then obviously, you know, people report catching them. And so they are out there, but there's a lot of unknowns. So we don't really know. And you'll see in the next slide, you know, there's dams on the main stem that sort of separate some of these groups. And so, you know, are these distinct populations? You know, how do they move in and out of these tributaries? Do they use, you know, do they make use of the main stem Deerfield? You know, is the main stem sort of a black hole where they go out and never come back? Do they go out, you know, get big and then come back and spawn? So, you know, there's a lot of unknowns here, a lot of questions to answer. And I think, you know, we can come up with, you know, some work to answer some of these, but I think it's sort of a lot of work that we can kind of do for a number of years to get a handle on these wild rainbow trout, because, you know, nobody's ever really done anything with them. They've always sort of been like, you know, whatever, there's some wild rainbows out there. And so it'd be, you know, just for curiosity, it's really an interesting situation. Next slide. So this is just a map then of where we've found wild rainbow trout either in the past or this year. And so the black are dams on the main stem. So, you know, between Fife Brook and what is that, number 4? I can never remember the dams, the order of dams. But anyway, that section there, you've got, you know, Chickley, Pelham, you know, Avery, Clesson. There's quite a few streams in that vicinity, in that section, that have wild rainbow trout. And really the hot spot is Clesson Brook and its tributaries. So that has, you know, a fully, you know, natural population with multiple age classes, multiple size classes. And so that's really sort of the hot spot. Some of those other ones, you know, Chickley River is sort of, you know, here and there. There's some records, some years with records, some years with not. Some of those smaller brooks like Avery and Wilder, same deal. Pelham Brook was interesting. We found, you know, multiple age classes, a lot of young of the year rainbow trout in Pelham Brook. And then as you move downstream, the other interesting situation, so that little one between those other two dams, again, forgive me, I never remember the names of those dams. That's Ruddock Brook. We didn't find any this year, but we do have historic records. And then the lower Bear River, which was an interesting situation because we found quite a few young of the year and multiple age classes, you know, 2 and 3 year old fish in or 1 and 2 year old fish, possibly 3 year old, but, you know, multiple age classes of young of the year fish. So it's a self-sustaining population in the Bear River, but that's quite a ways down from sort of where we find the most of those fish in like the Clesson Brook and upstream from there. So, you know, what's going on with these, you know, there's a lot of questions. I don't have a lot of answers because, you know, this is really, we're just starting to look into it. So, you know, down the road, it'll be some interesting insights. And then Green River is also kind of an anomaly. We have like 1 or 2 records of young of the year rainbow trout in there, but they're sort of quite a ways upstream from the main stem. You have a question, Mike?
Yeah, on the Green River, where does that begin? Is that around the 10 mile ridge?
I only have it highlighted the upper part, so it actually goes way, you know, I'm not exactly sure. I'm not familiar with some of those.
Historic data. Those aren't data you collect.
No, that's, you know, within the past 20 years, but not, you know, super recently. And it's only been like, you know, we find in the records, it's like 1 or 2, maybe 3 or something like that, and just pretty sporadic. But which is interesting because the Green River doesn't really have that many wild trout to begin with, you know, so I don't know what's going on there. So I think that's it. So yeah, that's all I've got. If people have questions.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for Adam?
You're talking about stocking, you're talking about or are you talking about all trout?
So the question is, when we're talking about no longer stocking trout into the upper Deerfield, are we talking about browns or browns and rainbows? Just browns. So I mean, the rainbow trout fishery, at this point, we don't know what's going on with the wild rainbow trout, but it's likely that it's nowhere near the status of the wild brown trout. And, the predominant, it's a wild brown trout fishery, but I'd argue that the bulk of the catch is made up of stocked rainbows. And so if we took that out, that would be a much bigger deal than if we took out, the few brown trout, stocked brown trout. So yeah, there's no talk of, unless we find some, crazy thing with the wild rainbows that we don't know but yeah, at this point, it's just brown trout, and it's very preliminary until Kevin starts bugging us. But it's very preliminary whether or not that is. But there are conversations. But I wanted to, the emphasis of that point was that those conversations never happened before, and now they actually are. So I think people in the agency have sort of come around to that way of thinking, at least for the Deerfield. And and I don't want to overstep what I'm saying, but I feel like there's been sort of a change in general on how we look at stocking. And it's been sort of, it has its place, but I feel like it's not sort of the same level that people used to consider stocking in Massachusetts. It's sort of taken a step back, and we've really focused on wild trout more specifically in the last, since I got here. So.
Well, it's a natural result of what's going on here. That the mindset of mass fishing wildlife has changed dramatically. It started.
The success of Montana not stocking, does that have any influence on the decision making here?
Not really, because the situation is so different. Our natural productivity is a tiny fraction of Montana's. There's so much development here. Even if there isn't so much in places like the Deerfield, we still have a number of dams disrupting how the river functions. So we have a lot more problems to deal with than places like Montana, where a lot of their issues are irrigation or cattle or something like that. Much less broadly developed and things like that. So it doesn't really take into account. And people do bring that up because it is sort of the poster child. But I mean, Montana's Montana. Can't really compare.
I have a question from someone. Let's see if I could do this.
Yes, hello.
Yeah.
David Wine,
Yes,
you have a
yes.
question?
I tuned in late. I had a question about the density of the wild rainbow trout. And Adam, I've been looking at some of your slides about wild trout management in Massachusetts, and I was wondering if any of those densities of rainbow trout would be amenable to your vision of, good or very good wild trout streams that could potentially become places that you acquire land or have special regulations, things of that nature.
So yeah, specifically on those wild rainbow trout streams.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think places like that you run into the issue with that there are because they're not native fish. There may be I don't know. Depends on who's going to be purchasing this land, or who's going to putting up money to purchase land. Whether it's going to be mass wildlife, are they going to decide to set aside land to protect fisheries of non-native fish? I'm not sure what sort of thought process goes into that. We have other biologists that are sort of on the lands committee. They do ask us for input, but I don't know if there may not be a problem with that. I just don't know sort of their thought process of where they want to put their resources into, protecting a non-native species or putting that money into a wild brook trout stream and protecting that. I'm not sure, but certainly places like Clesson especially, and for all intents and purposes, it looks like the lower Bear River has a pretty robust population of wild rainbow trout as well. I would have no issue with looking more closely at protecting that sort of fishery, but whether that means land acquisition, whatever, I'm not sure. That's sort of a question for sort of a more agency-wide kind of question.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah.
Adam, do you have a estimate on the proportion of rainbow trout to brown trout, just in general, not just the overview?
In the Deerfield?
Yeah, in your surveys.
So we don't have actual numbers for that because we only collect brown trout. But just visually, shortly after stocking, it seems like there's more rainbow trout. But as you move through the year, it becomes a little bit more even. But I can't really say. It may be because we don't have because we didn't do any sort of population estimate for rainbow trout. We didn't even net them except for the first year. But it turned out to be just too much work to weigh and measure rainbow trout if we weren't necessarily including that in our brown trout study. So, probably, should have done something, but it was just not sort of on the table for that. But I would say maybe 50-50, just visual estimation. But, obviously rainbow trout. So we have that, and I didn't mention it here because I haven't done a ton with the data just yet, but we do have that angler survey that's on your website that people still are filling out. It's sort of gotten a little bit less, but people are still filling it out. And it's like 2/3 rainbow trout. And it's probably, ultimately it's probably more like 50-50 in the river. And then later in the year, it's probably a higher proportion of brown trout. But for whatever reason, rainbow trout are just easier to catch, and then stocked rainbow trout are pretty easy to catch. And so they show up a much higher proportion of angler catch than they are sort of represented in the population. So, you go out and you fish and you catch 10 rainbow trout and 2 brown trout, you think there's a lot more rainbow trout, but it's probably a bit more even mix.
Thank you, Adam. Any more questions for Adam?
All right, well, thanks, guys.